The year is 1898, and the bottle in your hand is small. Brown glass, maybe 2 inches tall, with a paper label printed in red and black. The typeface is confident, a bold serif, the kind used for reliable things, trustworthy things. The company name appears at the top in neat lettering, Bayer. Beneath it the product name, Heroin, and beneath that in smaller text, Gegen Husten und Katar. Against coughs and catarrh. You are not a criminal, you're not reckless. You're a parent, perhaps, standing in a pharmacy in Elberfeld or Dresden or Vienna, or perhaps in a chemist's shop on a damp street in London, or a druggist counter in Philadelphia, and your child has had a cough since early autumn that has not gone away. The pharmacist smiled when he recommended it. He said it was the newest thing from Bayer. Very clean, very modern, nothing like the old remedies. The bottle is cool against your palm. You set it on the shelf beside the lamp when you get home, and for a moment you watch the amber light move through the glass. Outside, the century is almost over. The gas light is giving way to electric light in the wealthier districts. The telephone is becoming something ordinary. There are motor cars on certain streets in certain cities. Everything is becoming faster and brighter and more certain. The bottle catches the light. Your child is coughing somewhere down the hall. You measure out the dose. 1 teaspoon in a little warm water, just as the instructions say. You carry it carefully down the hall. The coughing stops before the evening is done. You will not think about the bottle again until it is empty, and when it is empty you will go back to the pharmacy and buy another. This is how it begins, in 1,000 houses, in 12 countries, in the last year of the 19th century. Quietly, reasonably, with the best intentions in the world. A world already drowning in morphine. To understand what heroin was, you have to understand what it was made to replace. By the 1890s, morphine had been in widespread use for nearly half a century. It had been isolated from opium in 1804 by a young German pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Zerturner, who was working in a pharmacy in Paderborn and was attempting to isolate the active constituent of opium from the complex mixture of alkaloids in which it naturally occurred. He named the compound after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. The name was precise. Morphine did what opium did, but faster and more reliably, and in a form that could be measured with scientific exactness, rather than estimated from the variable strength of a raw plant preparation. Morphine was soluble in water. It could be measured with a fine balance. It could be injected directly into the blood with the hypodermic syringe, which came into widespread medical use in the 1850s and 1860s. An instrument that had been developed nearly simultaneously in France and Britain in the late 1840s, and that represented, to the medical world of the mid-19th century, one of the most significant practical advances in the history of drug delivery. The syringe allowed medicine to reach the bloodstream directly, bypassing the unpredictable chemistry of the digestive system. For the first time, a physician could administer a drug and be certain, within a reasonably tight time window, of when and how strongly it would act. The result was a medical revolution and a humanitarian catastrophe arriving simultaneously and indistinguishably from each other. During the American Civil War, surgeons on both sides administered morphine by the millions of doses. They dusted it directly into open wounds. They injected it into soldiers before amputations and after, for the pain of recovery. They gave it for dysentery, which killed more soldiers than bullets did, and for the constellation of physical miseries that life in the field in the 1860s produced. They gave it for the particular kind of psychological agony that men who had survived battles carried back with them to their cots in the field hospitals, a state that the era had no adequate clinical vocabulary for, though later generations would recognize it as what they called shell shock, or combat fatigue, or post-traumatic stress. Morphine worked for this too, or appeared to, in that it quieted the person enough to get through the night. When the war ended, an estimated 400,000 Union and Confederate veterans were dependent on morphine. This figure is a reconstruction. The record-keeping of 1865 was not designed to capture this kind of epidemiological information, but it is supported by the volume of case reports and physician testimony that accumulated in the years after the war. The problem was so visible and so common that it acquired a popular name, soldier's disease. It was understood as a consequence of the war, a kind of wound, though the medical establishment of the era was less clear on what to do about it than on what had caused it. Morphine use spread outward from the battlefield into civilian life. Physicians prescribed it for pain, which was legitimate and often the most effective pain management available. They prescribed it for anxiety, for sleeplessness, for grief. They prescribed it for the broad category of female nervous complaints that Victorian medicine grouped loosely under the term hysteria, a category that encompassed conditions ranging from genuine psychiatric illness to the ordinary exhaustion of women living under the social and domestic constraints of the era, and that physicians treated with a combination of rest, moral counsel, and opiates. Patent medicine manufacturers added morphine and its relatives to their preparations without listing it on the label. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, sold across Britain and America to calm teething infants and fretful children, contained morphine and alcohol in quantities that would have sedated an adult of modest weight. Godfrey's cordial contained laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, and was marketed for similar purposes. These preparations were legal. They were recommended by pharmacists. They were advertised in newspapers and women's magazines. They sold in very large quantities. By the 1890s, it was conservatively estimated that there were between 200,000 and 400,000 morphine-dependent people in the United States alone. The figures in Britain and Germany were comparable by population. The medical establishment had begun to recognise, with varying degrees of discomfort and urgency, that it had participated in creating a problem of significant scale. Case reports of what physicians were calling morphinism, the condition of physical and psychological dependence on morphine, were appearing with increasing frequency in medical journals on both sides of the Atlantic. The pharmaceutical industry, which was coming into its modern form in the laboratories and factories of Germany in the 1870s and 1880s, was watching this situation with the particular attention of people who might be able to do something commercially useful about it. Germany had industrialized its coal tar dye industry in the decades following William Perkin's synthesis of Morphine in England in 1856, and had discovered in the process that the same chemical infrastructure and expertise could be applied to the alkaloids, the class of nitrogen-containing compounds that included morphine, cocaine, quinine, and many other pharmacologically active substances. The German pharmaceutical firms had the chemists, the equipment, the capital, and the scientific culture to investigate these compounds systematically and at scale. Bayer AG was founded in 1863 by Friedrich Bayer and Johann Friedrich Westcott in Barmen in the industrial Rhine Valley, initially as a dyestuffs company. By the 1880s and 1890s, like several of its competitors, Bayer had made pharmaceuticals a significant and growing part of its business, recognizing that the market for reliable, branded, patent-protected medicines was enormous, growing, and potentially much more profitable per unit than commodity dyestuffs. The company had launched phenacetin, a synthetic pain reliever, in 1887. It had aspirin in its laboratory pipeline, though that would not be released commercially until 1899. And in 1895, the head of Bayer's pharmaceutical research division, Heinrich Drieser, had turned his attention to the problem of morphine. The strategy was straightforward in its commercial logic. The medical world needed a morphine substitute, something that would provide equivalent pain relief and cough suppression without producing the dependence that morphine so reliably produced. If such a compound could be patented and manufactured and brought to market first, the company that owned it would have access to one of the most valuable drug markets in history. Drieser set his chemist to work on the problem. In 1897, Felix Hoffmann, a young chemist in Drieser's division, synthesized diacetylmorphine by acetylating morphine attaching acetyl groups to the 2 hydroxyl sites on the morphine molecule. The compound was not new. It had been first synthesized in 1874 by an English chemist named Charles Romley Alder Wright, working at St Mary's Hospital in London. Wright had conducted preliminary animal experiments with several acetylated derivatives of morphine and published his results in 1874 in the Journal of the Chemical Society. He had not pursued the compounds further. Nothing in his 1874 publication suggested that he recognised the pharmacological significance of what he had produced, and the compounds sat in the chemical literature for more than 20 years before Bayer's chemists encountered them. Dries tested diacetylmorphine on laboratory animals, then on Bayer employees who volunteered, then on himself. The results seemed, by every measure available in the Elberfeld laboratory of 1897, promising. The compound suppressed coughs. It appeared to relieve pain. It produced a sense of ease and comfort in the subjects who took it. And in the short-duration trials that Dries was able to conduct, it did not appear to produce the same physical craving that morphine produced. The subjects reported feeling better. They did not, in the weeks of the trial, report feeling that they needed the drug in the way that morphine-dependent patients reported needing theirs. In the autumn of 1898, Bayer presented diacetylmorphine to the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians in Munich. The company gave the drug its trade name around this time, Heroin, from heroish, heroic, or powerful. The name was a marketing choice, carefully considered, intended to communicate the drug's strength and the confidence of the company that produced it. It was also, in retrospect, an expression of the particular optimism that the late 19th century had developed about its own scientific achievements. They had named the drug for strength. They did not yet know what kind of strength they were dealing with. The world had been drowning in morphine for 50 years. Bayer offered a cure. It was called heroin. It cost roughly 50 pfennigs per gram. It was about to be shipped to pharmacies on 5 continents. The chemist who did not know what he had made Felix Hoffmann was 29 years old in the summer of 1897, and he was working at a pace that would have exhausted older men. He had joined Bayer in 1894 after completing his doctorate in chemistry at the University of Munich. He was by all accounts a careful and methodical researcher, the kind of man who kept his notebooks in order, who ran his reactions twice, who did not announce results until he was certain of them. The pharmaceutical division at Bayer's Elberfeld plant was still a relatively small operation within the company, but Heinrich Drieser, who ran it, had a talent for identifying promising chemists and giving them enough independence to pursue interesting problems. The morphine acetylation project was one of several Hoffmann was working on that year. The other, more famous one, was the chemical stabilization of salicylic acid, the project that would eventually produce aspirin. Hoffmann's notebooks show him moving between the 2 projects during the same weeks of August and September 1897, and there has been considerable historical debate about which discovery came first. The aspirin synthesis is recorded on 10 August 1897. The diacetylmorphine synthesis is recorded on 20 August. Both were accomplished within 11 days. The Elberfeld plant sat in the Rhine Valley, in the westernmost part of Germany, not far from the Belgian and Dutch borders. The Rhine Valley in the 1890s was one of the most intensively industrialized regions in the world. Coal mines and ironworks and textile mills lined the river. The air carried the particular quality of industrial air, a faint sharpness, a smell of coal and chemical exhaust that the workers who lived alongside the plants had long since ceased to notice. The Bayer laboratories were newer than most of the industrial buildings in the district, their purpose different, their ambitions running toward precision rather than scale. The chemists who worked in them wore clean white coats and weighed their materials on fine balances and recorded everything in numbered notebooks that were kept locked at the end of each working day. The chemistry itself was straightforward by the standards of the day. Morphine has 2 hydroxyl groups on its molecule, chemical attachment points in simplified terms. Acetylation, the process Hoffmann used, replaces those hydroxyl groups with acetyl groups. The result is a compound that is more fat-soluble than morphine, meaning it crosses the blood-brain barrier more rapidly. This is the pharmacological reason that heroin produces a faster, more intense effect than morphine. It reaches the brain more quickly, where it then converts back into morphine and binds to the same opioid receptors. Hoffmann did not know any of this in 1897. The mechanisms were not understood. What he knew was that he had produced a compound that, in preliminary animal tests, appeared to suppress coughs, suppress breathing difficulties, and reduce pain. Heinrich Drieser received Hoffmann's results with what appears, from the correspondence that survives, to have been careful and measured enthusiasm. Drieser was not the kind of scientist who announced conclusions prematurely. He was also not the kind of scientist who let a promising compound sit unused in a notebook. He authorized human trials. The initial subjects included Bayer employees who volunteered, and the results were, on the surface, encouraging. The compound worked. People who took it reported relief from coughs. People in pain reported that the pain became manageable, and crucially for Drieser's purposes, crucially for the story that Bayer was about to tell the world, the subjects in the early trials did not report the same craving and compulsive need that characterized morphine use. This was not because heroin was not addictive. It was, in fact, substantially more addictive than morphine, as later research would demonstrate beyond any doubt. The early trials missed this for several reasons. The trials were short, weeks, not months. The subjects were healthy adults taking standard doses under observation, not patients in chronic pain taking escalating doses over long periods. The withdrawal symptoms, which are severe and characteristic, did not manifest in subjects who took the drug for only a short time. Drieser saw what the trials showed him. He saw what he was looking for. This is not a uniquely dishonest failing. It is a limitation of all early-stage drug testing conducted without the benefit of the century of pharmacological knowledge that would accumulate after this moment. He wrote up his results with the precision and enthusiasm of a man who believes he has solved an important problem. His 1898 paper on diacetylmorphine, published in a German pharmacological journal, described the drug as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, effective against coughs, respiratory illness, and pain. He recommended it for use in tuberculosis patients who suffered severely from chronic coughing. He recommended it as a morphine substitute for patients who had developed dependence. He recommended it, essentially, for the largest and most valuable drug markets in the world. The name the company chose deserves a moment's attention. Heroin comes from the German heroisch, heroic or powerful. Bayer's naming department had form in this regard. They had named one of their earlier products aspirin from the Latin spirea, the plant from which salicylic acid was derived. The naming of pharmaceuticals in this era was a deliberate act of communication aimed at physicians and pharmacists who would receive a new product in the post and need to form an impression of it within seconds. Heroin communicated strength. It communicated modern, German, confident science. It communicated that this was not another hopeful patent remedy from an unknown manufacturer, but a serious pharmaceutical product from a serious pharmaceutical company. The Bayer marketing operation took Drieser's paper and turned it into something global. The company printed pamphlets in German, English, French, and Italian. It sent samples to physicians across Europe and North America. More than 10,000 letters were dispatched in the initial launch campaign. It exhibited heroin at medical conferences. It ran advertisements in medical journals that were careful and technical enough to read as scientific communications rather than sales material, which was both deliberate and not entirely misleading, since the scientific communication was also real. The framing was consistent and confident. Heroin was a new product from Bayer, the company that had given the world phenacetin and was about to give the world aspirin. It was safe. It was effective. It was modern. The price was set deliberately low to encourage adoption. A gram of heroin retailed at around 50 pfennigs in Germany in 1898, roughly comparable to a small loaf of bread. hospitals could purchase it in bulk at further reduced rates. The goal was market penetration. The goal was to make heroin the standard treatment for coughs and respiratory illness before competitors could produce a rival product. This was sound commercial logic, practiced by pharmaceutical companies in 1898 as it would be practiced by pharmaceutical companies in 1998 and 2024. The difference was not the logic of the business. The difference was what the compound being sold actually was. By the end of 1898, heroin was available in pharmacies in Germany, Austria, Britain, the United States, and more than a dozen other countries. It was available over the counter, without prescription, in most of them. Physicians were prescribing it enthusiastically. Patients were requesting it by name. The Bayer brand was attached to it, which in 1898 carried the weight of scientific credibility and German industrial precision. Felix Hoffmann, the man who had synthesized it in his notebook on a Tuesday in late August, watched all of this from his laboratory in Elberfeld. He continued working. There were other molecules to explore, other acetylation reactions to run, other problems that required his careful attention. The diacetylmorphine project had moved into the hands of the salesman and the marketing department. That was how it was supposed to work. He did not know what he had made. He had made it carefully and correctly and in good faith. In this, he was not unusual. The late 19th century was full of people who made things carefully and correctly and in good faith, and who could not see from where they were standing the distance between what they intended and what they had done. The distance in this case was very large. It would take more than a century to walk the full length of it. Hoffmann left Bayer in 1928. He retired to Switzerland, where he spent his final years in comfortable circumstances, his professional reputation resting almost entirely on aspirin. The connection to heroin was known but rarely emphasized in the accounts of his career published during his lifetime. He died in 1946 in Locarno, on the northern shore of Lake Maggiore. The lake is very still in autumn, and the light on it has the particular quality of alpine light in October, clear and cold and not quite reaching you the way it does in summer. The broader context in which Hoffmann was working matters to understanding what happened next. Bayer in 1897 was not merely a company with a product to sell. It was part of a scientific culture, the German chemical and pharmaceutical research culture, that had made genuine and important contributions to human welfare in the preceding decades, and that had earned a level of institutional trust commensurate with those contributions. When Bayer said that a compound was safe and effective, that claim carried the weight of that earned reputation. Physicians across Europe and North America who had no particular reason to doubt German pharmaceutical science received it in the spirit in which it was offered, as a serious scientific claim from a serious scientific institution. The machinery that Bayer deployed to bring heroin to market was sophisticated by the standards of 1898. The company's sales operation had been built on the success of its earlier pharmaceutical products and had the personnel, the contacts, and the distribution infrastructure to reach physicians and pharmacists rapidly and at scale. The 10,000 letters sent in the initial heroin launch campaign were not form letters sent to random addresses. They were targeted communications directed to physicians who had been identified as active prescribers in relevant specialties, pulmonologists, general practitioners, physicians with large urban practices, and who were therefore the most likely early adopters of a new respiratory medicine. Samples accompanied many of these communications. A physician who received a free sample of heroin in the post and administered it to a patient who had been coughing for 6 weeks and found that the patient's coughing stopped was conducting, from Bayer's perspective, the ideal clinical trial, a real-world test in a real patient that produced the result the company had predicted. The physician did not need to understand the full pharmacological mechanism. The physician needed to see that the drug worked, and in the short term, in the first weeks of administration, it did work. It worked reliably. This was not a fraud perpetrated on credulous physicians. It was a genuine pharmacological effect that happened to be accompanied by a second pharmacological effect that the available testing protocols could not detect. The decision to trademark the name heroin and to actively protect that trademark internationally was commercially significant but also had an unintended consequence. By attaching the Bayer brand to the drug so explicitly, and by making the trade name the primary identifier of diacetylmorphine for the first decade of its existence, Bayer created a situation in which the drug's reputation and the company's reputation were inextricably linked. When the evidence of heroin's addictive properties began to accumulate in the medical literature after 1901, that evidence was read by physicians who associated diacetylmorphine specifically with Bayer. The company that had introduced aspirin to the world had also introduced heroin. The association was not comfortable, and it became less comfortable as the decade progressed. The miracle the doctors ordered tuberculosis killed more people in the 19th century than any other single disease. It killed poets, and factory workers, and children, and middle-aged women who had seemed perfectly healthy until the first cough appeared. It killed slowly, over months and sometimes years, and it killed in a way that was visible and audible and intimate, in a way that other diseases of the era were not. The family heard it. The neighbours heard it through thin walls in the evenings. The physicians who visited their patients in rented rooms and tenement flats, and the quieter bedrooms of more prosperous households heard it and wrote about it in their casebooks, with a combination of clinical precision and barely concealed helplessness. Among tuberculosis's most demoralizing symptoms was an unrelenting cough, a cough that exhausted the body, disrupted sleep, tore at inflamed lung tissue, and in the final stages of the disease produced blood. There was a specific name in the medical literature for this blood-streaked coughing, hemoptysis. It was a word physicians used in their notes, and it was a word that appeared in the letters that dying people wrote to their families, and it was, in the late 19th century, one of the most feared words in the medical vocabulary because it indicated that the lungs were failing and that what remained of the patient's life was likely to be measured in weeks. Physicians who treated tuberculosis patients spent a great deal of their professional lives watching people cough. They had very little to offer those patients beyond rest, clean air, and the kind of morphine that everyone now understood to be deeply problematic. The tuberculosis sanatorium had been developed partly as a rescue and partly as a quarantine measure. Patients removed from the general population to prevent contagion and placed in mountain air on the theory, not entirely without foundation, that altitude and clean air slowed the disease's progress. The sanatoriums of Switzerland and Germany, of upstate New York and the American Southwest, were full of people who were resting as instructed and coughing despite the rest, and dying in the orderly fashion that the 19th century had learned to manage. When Bayer's literature arrived at their offices describing heroin as a reliable cough suppressant without morphine's addictive properties, many of these physicians were genuinely and understandably enthusiastic. The word that appears repeatedly in the early endorsements is relief. Relief that there was now something to offer, something new, something that might work without the costs that morphine had imposed on the patients who had come to depend on it. The physician community in 1898 and 1899 received heroin with a warmth that would, from a distance of more than a century, appear almost puzzling. Reports appeared in medical journals across Europe and America endorsing the drug for respiratory conditions. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal published an account in 1900 describing heroin as producing no craving in patients. The Journal of the American Medical Association carried similarly positive notices. The German medical press, which had the advantage of proximity to Bayer and the cultural habit of treating German pharmaceutical research with particular seriousness, was enthusiastic from the first months of the drug's release. The endorsements were not purchased in any direct sense that the historical record reveals. The physicians who wrote positively about heroin in 1899 were, in the large majority of cases, reporting what they had actually observed in their patients. What they had observed was real. The drug did suppress coughs. Patients who received heroin did sleep more easily. Patients with the exhausting breathlessness of advanced lung disease did find relief. The observations were accurate. The interpretation placed on them, that the relief was produced without the addiction risk that accompanied morphine, was the part that was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that the observation of short-term results could not reveal. The tuberculosis sanatorium was the site of heroin's earliest and most intensive clinical use. These were institutions scattered across the mountains of Switzerland and Germany, and the Adirondacks of upstate New York, and the dry air of the American Southwest, where patients with tuberculosis went to rest and breathe, and in the majority of cases to die more slowly than they would have done at home. Physicians at these sanatoriums administered heroin to control their patients' coughs, to allow them to sleep, to reduce the exhausting work of breathing that inflamed lungs demanded. The administration was careful and professional, and guided by the best knowledge then available. The patients found relief. This was not a fiction. Heroin did suppress coughs. It did ease breathing. It did allow sleep that had been interrupted for weeks to return. A patient in a sanatorium bed on the slopes above Davos, or in the Adirondack Hills above Saranac Lake, who had lain awake for 3 consecutive nights fighting a cough that would not stop, and who took heroin and slept, that patient experienced something real and genuinely beneficial. The physicians who watched this happen understood it as evidence that the drug was working as advertised. What was harder to see, in those early months, was what was developing beneath the surface. The body's opioid receptors, when repeatedly exposed to an opioid, begin to adjust. They become less sensitive to the drug's effects over time, a process called tolerance. The dose that produced relief on the first day produces less relief on the 5th, and substantially less on the 30th. The natural response for a patient in pain or respiratory distress, and for the physician treating that patient, was to increase the dose. The dose increased, the relief returned for a time, and then the cycle began again, at a higher level, requiring more drug to maintain the same effect. There is a second process that accompanies tolerance, which the early heroin trials had no way to capture: the development of physical dependence. When the brain's opioid receptors have been exposed to an external opioid over a sustained period, they change in ways that make the absence of the drug profoundly uncomfortable. The nervous system, which has adjusted its baseline to accommodate the presence of the opioid, becomes dysregulated when the opioid is removed. The result? Sweating, stomach cramps, muscle aches, anxiety, and overwhelming physical restlessness is what later medicine would call withdrawal. In 1899, it was a collection of symptoms that physicians had seen before in morphine-dependent patients, and now were beginning to see, with some confusion and concern, in patients who had been receiving the drug that was supposed to avoid exactly this outcome. Across a dozen sanatoriums, across hundreds of tuberculosis patients, across the winter of 1898 and into 1899, physicians were increasing doses and noticing with varying degrees of concern that their patients were asking for the drug with a frequency and urgency that seemed to exceed what the cough alone could explain. Some patients became distressed when the drug was delayed. Some reported symptoms between doses, sweating, stomach cramps, a generalized agitation, that the physicians initially attributed to the tuberculosis itself or to the anxiety that naturally accompanied serious illness. It was a reasonable attribution given what they knew, and it was wrong. The first published reports questioning heroin's safety began to appear in 1899 and 1900, but they appeared in smaller journals, and they were framed with the caution appropriate to a challenge directed at a well-funded and prestigious pharmaceutical company. Medical culture in this period did not encourage physicians to directly contradict the claims of major German pharmaceutical companies, which were regarded as the most scientifically rigorous in the world. Bayer was not a small or marginal manufacturer. It was one of the most technically respected industrial companies in Europe. Beyond the sanatoriums, heroin was being used for a vast range of conditions. British physicians prescribed it for asthma and bronchitis. American physicians prescribed it for post-surgical pain and for the management of morphine dependence. European physicians prescribed it for the anxious, sleepless, vaguely unwell conditions that the era grouped loosely under neurasthenia. It appeared in children's cough syrups. It appeared in headache preparations sold directly to consumers without physician involvement. It appeared, as morphine had appeared before it, as a constituent of the ordinary medical landscape. Something you took when you were not well, something that helped, something recommended by someone in a white coat whose job it was to know about such things. By 1902, enough physicians had encountered enough troubling patients that the medical journals were carrying something more than the initial enthusiasm. A pattern was emerging in the case reports. Patients who had begun heroin use for legitimate respiratory conditions and had found, after months of use, that they could not function without it. Patients who had been started on heroin to withdraw from morphine and had found, after months of heroin use, that they had simply exchanged one dependency for another, one that, some of them noted, seemed to grip them more tightly than the morphine had. Bayer's claim that heroin could treat morphine dependence was being tested in patients across the world, and the results were telling a different story. Bayer did not immediately retract its claims. The company had too much invested in the product, commercially and reputationally, to respond quickly to case reports that it could characterize as outliers or the product of exceptional circumstances. The marketing continued. The sales continued. The small brown bottles continued to move through pharmacies and post offices and medical supply chains into the hands of patients who had no particular reason to doubt what the label said. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. What the druggist kept behind the counter. In the United States in 1900, the patent medicine industry was one of the largest and most profitable sectors of the consumer economy. The term patent medicine was, by this point, something of a misnomer. The products were not, in most cases, patented in the legal sense. They were proprietary preparations sold under brand names, their formulas kept secret, their claims regulated by almost no one. A manufacturer could put morphine, cocaine, alcohol, cannabis, and chloroform into a single bottle and sell it as a cure for everything from dyspepsia to depression, and the law had nothing to say about it. The only federal restriction on what could be sold was that the label needed to carry the manufacturer's name and the price. What was in the bottle was nobody's business but the manufacturer's. The advertising for these products was conducted in newspapers that depended on the revenue it generated, and were therefore not inclined to scrutinize the claims too carefully. Full-page advertisements promised relief from conditions that had previously seemed beyond the reach of medicine. Testimonials from satisfied customers, many of them real, some of them invented, appeared in columns alongside the news of the day. The imagery was confident and reassuring. Drawings of healthy families, of competent-looking physicians, of before and after figures that communicated recovery. The language reached for the optimistic register that the 19th century had developed to describe its relationship with science. Modern, reliable, proven. Heroin arrived into this environment in 1898 and occupied a slightly more respectable position within it than most patent medicines. It was a branded product from a reputable European manufacturer, which gave it more credibility than the domestic patent preparations. But it also circulated in the same channels, through druggists, through catalogues, through the classified pages of newspapers and the back sections of general interest magazines. An American consumer in 1900 could order heroin by mail from a Sears Roebuck catalogue. The price was approximately 35 cents for a small bottle, which placed it within reach of most household budgets. The geography of heroin use in early 20th century America was not uniform. Urban centers, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, had higher rates of use, partly because they had larger populations and more physicians, and partly because the culture of urban consumer medicine in this period was more developed than in rural areas. Immigrants who had come from Germany, Austria, and other parts of Central Europe brought with them familiarity with German pharmaceutical products, including Bayer preparations, and with the European medical culture that had received heroin enthusiastically. But rural America had its own relationship with patent medicines and mail-order remedies, and heroin appeared in farm households and small-town druggists with less fanfare and rather more regularity than later accounts of the drug's history sometimes suggest. The populations most heavily exposed to heroin in its early American years were those who had already been most heavily exposed to morphine. Veterans from the Civil War who had survived into the 1890s and 1900s, now in their 50s and 60s, were sometimes transitioned from morphine to heroin by physicians who believed they were offering an improvement. Women who had been prescribed morphine for nervous complaints or menstrual pain, or the category of conditions grouped under the term female complaints, were offered heroin as the newer, safer option. The substitution was medically well-intentioned. It was, in practice, a replacement of one physical dependence with another, more potent one. Some patients noticed this themselves. The diaries and letters that survive from this period, particularly from women who were using heroin under medical supervision, describe a pattern that was recognizable even to people who had no clinical framework for understanding it. A woman in Boston, writing to her sister in 1901, described the feeling of missing her midday dose and the way her body had begun to expect it the way it expected food, not as a desire, she wrote, but as a need, physical and impossible to ignore. She had asked her physician about it. He had told her it was the neurasthenia reasserting itself between doses, and that this was why she must not miss them. This response was not unusual, and it was not entirely dishonest. The medical profession had not yet developed a clear and clinically actionable understanding of opioid dependence as a distinct physiological phenomenon separate from the underlying condition being treated. Physicians had seen morphine-dependent patients go through withdrawal, and they had the empirical observation of that experience to draw on. But the theoretical framework that would allow them to understand what they were seeing, as a matter of receptor physiology and neurological adaptation, did not exist. In the absence of that framework, the most available interpretation was that the patient's underlying condition was more serious than initially appreciated and required continued medication. The druggist himself was a figure of genuine community authority in the small towns and urban neighborhoods of 1900. He was often the first point of medical contact for people who could not easily or affordably consult a physician. He knew his regulars. He knew which families were struggling, which elderly men came in with the particular careful walk of someone managing chronic pain, which young women came in flushed and vague-eyed, with a frequency that went beyond any stated medical condition. He was not required to ask questions. He was, in most states, not prohibited from selling heroin to anyone who came to his counter with the correct amount of money. He sold what people asked for. The Proprietary Association of America, which represented the patent medicine manufacturers, was by this period aware that some of its members' products were causing the kind of dependence problems that were beginning to attract public attention. Muckraking journalism, a form that was flourishing in the early years of the 20th century, had begun to examine the patent medicine industry with some of the same critical attention it brought to the meatpacking industry and the railroad trusts. Samuel Hopkins Adams published a series of articles in Collier's Weekly in 1905 and 1906 titled The Great American Fraud, exposing the contents and the false claims of major patent medicine brands. The articles reached an enormous audience. They made people angry. The response of the patent medicine industry was defensive and, for a time, effective. The Proprietary Association lobbied vigorously against any federal legislation that would require ingredient disclosure or restrict the sale of habit-forming substances. The argument was economic. Disclosure would hurt sales, but it was framed publicly as a matter of individual liberty and states' rights. The federal government had no business telling American manufacturers what to put on their labels, and no business telling American consumers what to purchase. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, passed in the same year that Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had focused public outrage on the food industry, required for the first time that patent medicines list their ingredients on their labels. This was not a prohibition. Heroin was still perfectly legal to manufacture and sell. But consumers who had been buying soothing syrups and headache powders without knowing their contents now saw the ingredients spelled out. Some of them were disturbed, some of them were not. Some of them had already understood, in some inarticulate way, what was in the bottle and did not particularly want to stop purchasing it. The act changed the conversation without immediately changing the market. Buyers' heroin continued to sell. Domestic manufacturers of heroin-containing preparations continued to operate. The number of people in the United States with physical dependence on heroin and morphine was, by the estimates that various investigators were beginning to produce in the early years of the 20th century, somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000, a range that reflected both genuine uncertainty about the scale of the problem and the methodological difficulty of counting a population that had considerable incentive to remain invisible. The druggist in his shop knew some of these people by name. He had been selling to some of them for years. He had watched some of them age and some of them decline and some of them recover in ways that seemed improbable and then relapse in ways that seemed inevitable. He kept the bottles behind the counter as he kept other valuable merchandise behind the counter, partly for security and partly because it had become slightly awkward to have them on open display. The conversation had changed, even if the shelves had not. In the years between 1906 and 1914, the pressure for more significant legislation was building from several directions at once, from physicians, from temperance activists who had extended their concerns to opiates, from progressive reformers who believed that government had an obligation to protect citizens from predatory commercial practices, and from a growing body of public health work that was making the scale of the problem harder to dismiss. The druggist behind his counter, selling what people asked for, was part of a system that was working against itself, and the system was about to change. The experience of Chinese immigrant communities on the west coast of the United States offers a different window into the heroin market of the early 20th century. Chinese immigrants had brought with them a culture of opium smoking that dated to the era of the British enforced opium trade in China, a trade that had created widespread opium dependence across large portions of the Chinese population as a direct consequence of British commercial and military policy in the mid-19th century. In San Francisco and other cities with substantial Chinese populations, opium dens had operated openly in the decades following the gold rush, serving a customer base that included both Chinese immigrants and, in many establishments, white Americans who were drawn by curiosity or by the experience itself. The political response to opium use in Chinese communities was among the earliest examples of drug enforcement in the United States, and it was explicitly racial in its framing. Ordinances restricting opium dens in San Francisco in the 1870s and 1880s were framed in terms of the threat that Chinese drug practices posed to white society, and the imagery of the opium den in American popular culture of the era, the seductive Asian woman, the white victim rendered passive and helpless, was a racial fantasy that bore limited relationship to the actual demographics and sociology of opium use in these establishments. This racialized framing of the opium problem was available to the legislators and reformers who built the early federal drug control framework, and they used it. The woman in the domestic interior, white, middle class, prescribed heroin or morphine by her physician for a nervous condition, and the Chinese laundry worker in an opium den served different narrative functions in the political imagination of the era, though both might be pharmacologically dependent on an opioid alkaloid derivative. The woman's dependence was framed as a medical misfortune, something that had happened to her through no fault of her own, something that the medical system had a responsibility to address. The Chinese man's use was framed as a racial threat, something to be policed and punished. These different framings would shape drug policy and drug enforcement in the United States for the next century, in ways that the demographic distribution of heroin use would repeatedly expose as inconsistent and unjust. What the war took away. In the autumn of 1914, Germany and the United States were still nominally at peace, but the war that had begun in August was already reshaping the global economy in ways that would take years to fully understand. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act had been passed by Congress in December 1914, a piece of legislation that would fundamentally alter the legal landscape for opiates in the United States. The Act's passage preceded the American entry into the war by nearly 3 years, but the two events were not unconnected in the broader political atmosphere of the era. The progressive reform impulse that had produced the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 was still active. The public health arguments for federal oversight of narcotics had been accumulating for almost a decade, and the international dimension of the opiate problem had been formalized in 1912 with the Hague Opium Convention, which committed signatory nations to controlling the manufacture and distribution of morphine and cocaine. The Harrison Act, named for its congressional sponsor, Francis Burton Harrison of New York, was framed not as a prohibition, but as a revenue measure. Manufacturers and distributors of opiates and cocaine were required to register with the federal government and pay a small tax on each transaction. This framing was partly practical. Congress's taxing authority was less constitutionally contested than a direct prohibition, and partly a reflection of genuine ambivalence about how far the federal government should go in regulating substances that physicians and pharmacists were using in their legitimate professional practice. The racial dimension of the Harrison Act's passage is part of the historical record and cannot be separated from the Act's history. Congressional debates and the newspaper reporting that preceded the vote mobilized anxieties about Chinese opium use on the West Coast, and separately about cocaine use among black men in the South. Anxieties expressed in terms that were explicitly racial and that shaped both the legislation's framing and the political coalition that supported it. This dimension of the Act does not negate the genuine public health argument for some form of opiate regulation, but it is part of what the Act was and where it came from. As interpreted by the Treasury Department's enforcement arm in the years following 1914, the Harrison Act effectively made non-medical use of opiates a federal crime. More significantly, a series of Supreme Court decisions between 1919 and 1922 held that a physician's registration under the Harrison Act did not authorize the prescription of opiates to a patient for the purpose of maintaining their addiction. This interpretation removed from the medical system the ability to manage opioid-dependent patients through maintenance prescribing, the approach that some physicians had been using to stabilize patients whose lives had been disrupted by dependence and reduce their exposure to the harms of the illicit market. The effect of this interpretation was to push opioid-dependent people out of the medical system and into the criminal market. A person who had been managing their heroin or morphine use through a physician's prescription now had to obtain the drug illicitly, at higher cost and greater risk, or go through a withdrawal that without medical supervision could be severely physically dangerous. This was not an unintended consequence that no one had anticipated. Public health physicians and some medical organizations had specifically warned that this would happen. The warning was not heeded. In Germany, meanwhile, the Bayer company was navigating the disruptions of wartime in its own way. The chemical and pharmaceutical industries had been heavily redirected toward military production. The same industrial infrastructure that produced pharmaceutical compounds produced explosives, and, in the case of some of Bayer's sister companies in the German chemical industry, the poison gases that were deployed in the trenches of the Western Front beginning in 1915. Friedrich Bayer's company had been founded to make dyestuffs. The First World War demonstrated comprehensively that the capacity to make dyestuffs and the capacity to make poison gas were the same capacity directed toward different ends. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the status of Bayer's American interest became a matter of federal law rather than commercial strategy. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 gave the federal government broad powers to seize the assets of enemy nationals operating in the United States. Bayer's American subsidiary was confiscated, its facilities, its inventory, and its trademark registrations, including the heroin trademark, were placed under the control of the Office of the Alien Property Custodian. In 1918, those properties were sold at public auction. Sterling Drug, an American pharmaceutical company, purchased the Bayer brand rights in the United States for approximately $6 million. The deal included the right to use the Bayer cross and the aspirin trademark, which would prove to be the valuable part of the purchase. The heroin trademark was also part of the package, but by 1918 it had considerably less commercial value than it had possessed 20 years earlier. Sterling Drug used the heroin brand for a time, then quietly discontinued it as the drug's reputation in the United States moved beyond recovery. Heinrich Drieser, the man who had supervised the development of both aspirin and heroin, did not live to see the full consequences of the latter. He died in 1924. He had received substantial royalty payments from aspirin sales during his career, and was, in material terms, a wealthy and professionally successful man. The accounts of his later life suggest that he experienced health difficulties, though the historical record on this point is not entirely consistent. What is clear is that by the time of his death, the drug he had described in 1898 as a non-addictive morphine substitute had been recognized internationally as one of the most addictive substances known to medicine. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 stripped Germany of its overseas intellectual property rights in countries that had been at war with it, including in those markets where Bayer had not already lost its trademark registrations to wartime seizure, the right to use the heroin brand name. The treaty further required Germany to make its chemical and pharmaceutical manufacturing processes available to Allied nations. The industrial and intellectual property base that had made Bayer one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the world was significantly dismantled by the peace that followed the war. The German pharmaceutical industry reorganized itself through the 1920s under very different economic and political conditions. Bayer, along with several other major German chemical companies including BASF and Höchst, merged into the conglomerate IG Farben in 1925. The Bayer name continued to exist as a brand within IG Farben, but the company structure was transformed. IG Farben would go on to play a significant and deeply troubling role in the Second World War. Its factories used slave labour, and one of its subsidiaries manufactured the pesticide Zyklon B, which was used in the Nazi extermination camps. After the Second War, IG Farben was broken up by the Allied Control Council. Bayer re-emerged as an independent company in 1951. The world that had received heroin in 1898 with such enthusiasm, a world of pharmacy counters and confident medical journals and Bayer letterheads and mothers carrying small brown bottles home from the chemists, was gone. The legal structure that had made that world possible was dismantled. The commercial structure that had produced and sold the drug was fragmented by war and seizure and corporate reorganization. What remained was a drug, still very much present in the world, now produced and distributed outside any of the legal frameworks within which it had begun, finding its way to the people who needed or wanted it through channels that the manufacturers of 1898 would not have recognized, and that no government in 1920 had the tools to fully understand or control. There is a dimension of the Harrison Act passage that belongs specifically to the history of heroin, and not just to the history of opiate regulation in general. By 1914, heroin had been on the market for 16 years. The medical literature on its addictive properties was substantial enough that a physician who had been reading the relevant journals since 1901 would have encountered case reports documenting heroin dependence in considerable detail. The claim that heroin was safer than morphine had been repeatedly and publicly challenged in print. Bayer had maintained the claim nonetheless, because the claim was commercially necessary, and because there was enough ambiguity in the scientific discussion to make definitive refutation difficult in the absence of the large-scale, long-duration trials that would have settled the matter unambiguously. The international dimension of heroin regulation in this period deserves a moment. The Hague Opium Convention of 1912, the first multilateral agreement on drug control, committed signatory nations to limiting the manufacture and distribution of morphine, heroin, and cocaine to medical and scientific purposes. Germany, Britain, France, the United States, and a number of other powers signed. Implementation was uneven and in some cases essentially nominal, but the convention established the principle that opioid control was an international matter requiring international coordination. This principle would shape every subsequent framework for global drug control through the 20th century and beyond. For the dependent patients who were most directly affected by the Harrison Act enforcement regime, the consequences were experienced in terms they understood intimately: access and cost. The person in New York or Chicago or San Francisco who had been purchasing heroin from a pharmacy at commercial prices woke up, in the years following 1914, into a market that had changed around them while their physical need had not. The pharmacist who had sold to them for years was no longer in a position to do so without legal risk. The physician who had prescribed was now uncertain of their legal standing. The criminal market that would eventually supply them was still developing its infrastructure, and in the early transition years the gap between the legal supply that had been removed and the illicit supply that was forming left. Many people in a period of painful and dangerous scarcity. The trade that found its own way. When legal heroin disappeared from the pharmacy counter, the people who needed it did not stop needing it. This seems, stated plainly, obvious. But it was not obvious to the legislators and enforcement officials who framed drug policy in the 1910s and 1920s as a problem of supply. The dominant assumption was that if the supply was cut off, the problem would diminish and eventually end. The assumption was that dependence was sustained primarily by availability, and that removing availability would effectively remove the dependence. The experience of the following decades demonstrated, with considerable human cost, that this was not how opioid dependence worked. The illicit heroin trade had existed at the margins before the Harrison Act's enforcement regime removed the drug from the legal market. In the years after 1914, and particularly after the Supreme Court decisions of 1919 to 1922, it expanded rapidly to serve a much larger and more desperate customer base. The supply chains that fed this expansion were global from the beginning, drawing on the same opium-producing regions that had supplied the pharmaceutical industry, now operating outside any regulatory framework. The primary opium-producing regions in the 1920s and 1930s were Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and across a broad arc of South and Southeast Asia. The opium was harvested in the form familiar to centuries of trade. The dried latex scraped from incised poppy capsules. It was then moved through a chain of intermediaries, converted into morphine base in rudimentary processing facilities, and then acetylated into heroin in chemical laboratories that ranged in sophistication from large-scale industrial operations to rooms equipped with basic equipment and the right chemical knowledge. The conversion chemistry was not complex by the standards of professional pharmaceutical manufacturing, but it required a degree of chemical knowledge that was not universally distributed. The people who possessed it, many of them trained in the very German pharmaceutical tradition that had produced heroin in the first place, commanded significant premiums for their expertise. In the 1920s and early 1930s, some of the most important heroin processing operations were run by individuals with genuine pharmaceutical backgrounds, who had found that their skills were worth far more in the illicit market than in legitimate employment. The heroin that reached American cities typically began as Turkish or Iranian opium. It was converted in Europe, particularly in France, where facilities in and around Marseille had been operating since the pre-war years, and in Germany, where the remnants of the pharmaceutical industry's expertise persisted in clandestine form. The finished heroin was then smuggled across the Atlantic in the luggage of travellers, hidden in commercial cargo, or transferred at sea between vessels operating outside Port Authority oversight. In New York, which was the primary point of entry into the American market, it was received by criminal distribution networks that had the infrastructure and the street-level reach to move it to retail customers. the price of illicit heroin rose throughout the 1920s. A substance that had cost 35 cents per bottle at the pharmacy counter in 1905 now cost many times that amount through illicit channels, and the quality was inconsistent. The purity of illicit heroin varied enormously, depending on the supply chain from which it came, the number of times it had been cut with inert or less inert adulterants, and the practices of the particular dealer selling it at retail. A user had no reliable way to know the potency of what they were purchasing. This made dosing unpredictable, and overdose a constant background risk. The financial pressure created by rising illicit prices was cascading in its effects. People who had been managing their dependence on a few cents worth of heroin per day, while employed and housed, found themselves spending many times that amount as prices rose. Employment became more difficult to maintain when a significant portion of each day was structured around obtaining and using the drug. Housing became harder to maintain when a significant portion of income was spent on heroin. The relationships that might otherwise provide stability, family, long-term partners, community connections, were often strained or severed by the demands that dependents placed on time and money and emotional energy. The criminal law response to this population was not sympathetic. The Harrison Act's enforcement, as interpreted through the early 1920s, treated opioid-dependent people primarily as criminals rather than as patients. Possession of heroin without a legitimate medical registration was a federal offence. The penalties were not trivial. Federal prisons held a significant and growing population of people whose primary offence was related to their own opioid dependence, and whose incarceration did not address the physical and psychological dimensions of that dependence in any way that reduced recidivism. In Shanghai and other Chinese coastal cities, the situation unfolded differently but along related lines. Shanghai in the 1920s was one of the most extraordinary cities in the world, a semi-colonial port city of approximately 3 million people, governed across 3 separate jurisdictions: the international settlement, administered by a municipal council dominated by British and American interests, the French concession, administered by the French consul, and the Chinese municipality of Greater Shanghai. No unified legal system operated across all 3 jurisdictions. What was prohibited in one area could be conducted openly in another. Heroin and morphine circulated through Shanghai with enormous freedom. The opium trade had been entangled with Shanghai's economy since the First Opium War, which Britain had fought in the 1840s, partly to protect its right to sell Indian opium to Chinese consumers. The Sassoon family and other trading houses had built substantial fortunes from the opium trade in the preceding decades. By the 1920s, the trade had diversified into processed drugs, morphine and heroin, that were more compact, more potent, and more profitable per unit weight than raw opium. The League of Nations Advisory Committee on Trafficking in Opium and Other Dangerous Drugs was receiving reports throughout the 1920s from its member states documenting the scale of the global heroin trade. The reports were careful and detailed, and in many cases deeply alarming. They documented processing facilities, smuggling routes, the quantities moving through various ports, the identities of some of the principal organisers. The committee produced recommendations and conventions. The conventions were signed with varying degrees of genuine commitment to enforcement. What the League could not do was change the economic logic that drove the trade. The profit margins on illicit heroin were, even at this early stage, extraordinary. A kilogram of opium purchased in Turkey or Iran and converted into heroin, then moved to the American market, represented a return on investment that legitimate commerce could not approach. The cost of bribing officials, losing shipments to seizure, operating clandestinely and accepting the occasional prosecution was a cost of business that the margins could easily absorb. As long as that economic logic held, the trade would continue. New entrants would replace those who were caught. New supply chains would replace those that were disrupted. In New York City, by the late 1920s, the distribution of heroin had developed the hierarchical structure that would characterize it for the following decades. At the top, importers with the capital and the criminal connections to move product across international borders. Beneath them, wholesalers who purchased in quantity and broke shipments into the units. that could be managed by distribution networks. Then street-level dealers who maintained retail relationships with the end users, some of them dealing primarily to support their own dependents, some purely for commercial reasons, most somewhere between the two. The users at the bottom of this supply chain paid the highest prices, accepted the most risk from impure product, and received the least of the system's considerable profits. The world had changed since the small brown bottle sat on the pharmacy shelf. The drug was the same. The need was the same. Everything else had been reconstructed around it. The economic analysis of the illicit heroin trade in this period, conducted by the few economists who turned their attention to it in the 1920s and 1930s, produced findings that were counterintuitive to policymakers accustomed to thinking about drug enforcement in moral rather than market terms. The standard supply-side enforcement response to drug trafficking, seizing shipments, prosecuting distributors, imposing penalties designed to raise the cost and risk of participation, had predictable economic effects that did not necessarily produce the intended public health outcomes. Seizures reduced supply temporarily, which raised prices, which increased the financial pressure on dependent users without reducing their physical need for the drug. Higher prices created stronger incentives for suppliers to take risks, because the profit margins on the remaining supply were correspondingly larger. The heroin that reached American users in the 1920s and 1930s varied considerably in purity, and this variation was itself a source of danger. An illicit market without regulatory oversight of product quality produces products of inconsistent strength, and a user who has calibrated their dose to the purity of one batch may find that a subsequently obtained batch, at a different purity level, produces a very different effect than expected. Overdose in the illicit heroin market of this era was not primarily a consequence of users taking more than they intended. It was often a consequence of users taking what they believed to be the same amount as always and finding that the drug was stronger than they had anticipated. The absence of quality control, which regulation would have provided, was itself a source of mortality that the enforcement-focused framework did not address. Women who used heroin in the 1920s and 1930s in the illicit market that had replaced the pharmacy occupied a particularly difficult position within an already difficult situation. The legal and social structures of the era provided limited recourse for women dealing with any kind of medical or legal crisis, and the stigma attached to drug use, which in the post-Harrison Act environment was increasingly coded as criminal rather than medical, fell with particular force on women, for whom drug dependence represented a more severe violation of the social expectations attached to their gender. The diaries and court records and social work case files that document these women give a picture of people navigating systems that were rarely designed with their welfare in mind. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Long Shadow over Harlem. The Second World War disrupted the global heroin trade in the same way it disrupted everything else, abruptly, and in ways that reorganized the underlying structures permanently. The transatlantic routes that had carried heroin from European processing laboratories to American ports were closed or severely compromised by wartime naval operations. German U-boats, the Allied convoy system, the general militarization of the Atlantic made commercial smuggling considerably more difficult and dangerous than it had been in the 1930s. The criminal networks that had handled distribution in American cities spent the war years in relative heroin scarcity, sustained partly by domestic stockpiles that were worked down steadily and by what could be obtained from the limited supply that still moved through Pacific and Latin American channels. Use rates in American cities declined during the war, not because the demand had changed or the underlying physiological reality of dependence had shifted, but because the supply chains had been severed. This would later be cited in some policy discussions as evidence that supply-side enforcement could produce significant reductions in use. It was more accurately evidence that a world war is extremely effective at disrupting international shipping. The comparison between wartime disruption of supply chains and peacetime drug enforcement was not as illuminating as it was sometimes made to appear. When the war ended, the trade rebuilt itself. The rebuilding took several years and did not simply restore the pre-war pattern. The French Connection, a term that would become famous when it was used as the title of a 1971 film, described the new dominant pathway for heroin reaching the American market. Corsican criminal networks that had their roots in the Marseille underworld and had been active in some cases in wartime resistance activities now applied their organisational skills and their criminal infrastructure to the heroin trade. The supply chain ran from Turkish and Iranian opium fields through laboratories in and around Marseille, where chemists with genuine pharmaceutical expertise converted morphine base into high-grade heroin. The finished product was then packed and shipped to the United States through a variety of concealment methods, in luggage, in commercial cargo, in the personal effects of travellers who were paid for the risk. In New York, it was received by American organised crime networks, primarily those associated with the Italian-American mafia families that had consolidated their position during Prohibition, who distributed it through their established street networks. The heroin that came through the French Connection was, by the standards of the pre-war illicit supply, remarkably pure, typically between 70 and 90% diacetylmorphine. This was a consequence of the Marseille laboratory's sophistication and the relatively short supply chain between production and the major American distribution point. It also meant that American users who had become accustomed to the heavily diluted and inconsistent product available during the war years were encountering a significantly more potent substance. Overdose deaths in major American cities began to rise in the late 1940s and continued to rise through the 1950s. The geography of heroin use in post-war American cities was shaped by forces that had very little to do with the drug itself. Harlem in New York was among the first and most severely affected communities, and the reasons for this reflect the broader social history of the mid-20th century United States with uncomfortable clarity. The neighborhood had been a center of African American cultural and intellectual life during the Renaissance of the 1920s, a moment of extraordinary creative energy that produced literature, music, visual art, and political thought of lasting significance. By the 1940s, Harlem was dealing with overcrowding, economic marginalization, housing discrimination that prevented black residents from moving to the expanding suburbs where white families were building post-war prosperity, and the particular pressures that decades of migration from the South had placed on an urban infrastructure that was neither designed nor funded to support the population it now held. Heroin moved into this environment and found conditions that made its spread not inevitable, but comprehensible. Economic exclusion limited legitimate opportunities. Housing instability made long-term planning difficult. Medical care was limited and often inadequate for a population that was both poorer and more exposed to the stresses of discrimination than the white communities on the other side of invisible lines that nonetheless functioned as walls. In this context, a drug that provided temporary relief from circumstances that were otherwise beyond individual control had a particular appeal, not because black communities were inherently more susceptible to addiction, a notion that had no scientific foundation and considerable racist history, but because the conditions that made addiction more likely to take hold were more prevalent in communities that had been structurally excluded from the post-war prosperity. Jazz musicians occupy a specific place in the history of heroin in this era. They worked late hours, often under physical and psychological pressure, in a profession that offered both extraordinary creative fulfillment and considerable material precariousness. The social world of the jazz musician in the 1940s and 1950s brought them into contact with heroin early and with some frequency. The musicians who became dependent, and there were many, including some of the most significant artists of the 20th century, were not uniform in how the dependence affected their work and their lives. Some continued to produce music of extraordinary quality. Some saw their careers destroyed. Some died young. Charlie Parker died in 1955 at 34. His physician, examining him for what turned out to be the final time, estimated his physical age at somewhere between 50 and 60 years. The years of dependence, the associated poverty and instability, the absence of sustained medical care had aged his body beyond its chronological years. Billie Holiday died in 1959, 50 years old, in a hospital room in New York where she had been arrested for possession while receiving medical treatment for the liver failure that was killing her. Chet Baker lived longer, but not better in many respects. His cheekbones were broken in a beating connected to drug debts in 1968, and he spent the remaining 20 years of his life visibly marked by decades of heroin use before his death in Amsterdam in 1988. Harry Anslinger headed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from its founding in 1930 to his retirement in 1962. He was the dominant figure in American drug enforcement for 3 decades, and his approach to heroin dependence was consistent across those decades. It was a moral failing, a criminal behavior, and a social menace, and the appropriate response to it was criminal prosecution, deterrence, and the longest possible prison sentences for those caught trafficking in narcotics. Anslinger had no sympathy for the medical framing of dependence, and no patience for physicians who argued for treatment rather than punishment. Under Anslinger's influence, and with the political support that his fear-based public communications generated, federal penalties for narcotics offences were substantially increased throughout the 1950s. The Narcotic Control Act of 1956 imposed mandatory minimum sentences that removed judicial discretion from narcotics cases. A first-time possession offence carried a minimum of 2 years. A first trafficking offence carried 5 years. A second trafficking offence carried 10 to 40 years, with the possibility of the death penalty for selling heroin to someone under 18. These penalties fell with considerable statistical consistency on the people who were most visible and most easily caught: street-level users and small-scale dealers in communities already subject to intensive policing. The importers and large-scale distributors, insulated from direct street contact by layers of organizational hierarchy, were substantially harder to prosecute. The pattern was visible in the data. The prison population for narcotics offences was overwhelmingly black and Hispanic, not because heroin use was more prevalent in these communities than in white communities. Later research would consistently find that drug use rates did not differ sharply by race, but because enforcement was concentrated in communities of colour, and because the socio-economic conditions that led to visible street-level dealing were more prevalent there. The physicians who might have provided an alternative to the criminal justice system were operating under legal constraints that made clinical treatment of opioid dependence nearly impossible. The Supreme Court decisions of the early 1920s had not been formally reversed. A physician who maintained a patient on heroin or morphine as part of a treatment plan risked losing their medical license and facing federal criminal prosecution. The effect was to remove the medical system almost entirely from the management of heroin dependence for 3 decades, a period during which the medical understanding of opioids, addiction, and treatment was advancing rapidly in ways that could have translated into effective clinical practice if the legal framework had permitted it. The decade of the 1950s closed on cities where heroin had been present long enough to have shaped neighborhoods and careers and families and medical practices in ways that were no longer deniable. The conversation about what to do about it was finally, slowly, beginning to engage with the possibility that the approaches tried so far had not worked. The geography of enforcement in mid-century American cities produced a pattern that public health researchers in later decades would document with considerable statistical precision. The concentration of both heroin use and heroin-related criminal prosecution in communities of colour was not a reflection of differential rates of drug use across racial lines. Survey data, when it eventually became available in sufficient quality to allow this question to be answered, consistently showed that rates of illicit drug use did not differ dramatically across racial groups. What differed dramatically was the rate at which drug use led to arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. Policing was concentrated in certain neighborhoods. Enforcement was applied more aggressively in those neighborhoods. The result was that the criminal justice consequences of drug use fell with striking unevenness on people who were not using drugs at higher rates than their less pleased counterparts. The physical environment of heroin use in Harlem and comparable neighborhoods in the 1940s and 1950s was shaped by the broader physical environment of those neighborhoods, an environment that reflected decades of municipal underinvestment, housing discrimination that had maintained overcrowding, and the absence of the civic amenities and infrastructure that more affluent areas took for granted. The buildings were older, the heat in winter was less reliable, the hospitals were more crowded and the medical staff spread more thinly. These conditions did not cause heroin use, but they shaped the context in which heroin use occurred and the resources available to people who wanted to address it. The treatment that was available to heroin-dependent people in this era was limited not only by law but by practical resources. The few treatment facilities that existed, sanatoriums operated by the federal government, the 2 public health service narcotics hospitals at Lexington, Kentucky and Fort Worth, Texas, that had been established in the 1930s, operated primarily on an abstinence model and were located far from the urban centres where most heroin-dependent people lived. Patients who went to Lexington came back to the same environments and the same networks that had structured their use before they left. Relapse rates were high. The treatment advocates of the era who argued that you could not treat drug dependence without addressing the social and environmental factors that surrounded it were describing what the evidence consistently showed. The war that brought it home. Again. Vietnam changed the heroin story in ways that took years to fully appear, and the ways it changed it were not all the ways that were initially feared. American military personnel began arriving in South Vietnam in significant numbers in the mid-1960s. By 1969, there were more than 500,000 American service members in the country. They were serving 12-month combat rotations in conditions that were physically grueling and psychologically peculiar in ways that differed from the experience of soldiers in previous American wars. The nature of guerrilla warfare in the Vietnamese countryside, the absence of front lines, the difficulty of distinguishing combatants from civilians, the sense of fighting in a country whose population was not uniformly welcoming, and whose political situation was deeply ambiguous, produced a form of military service that had no close precedent in American experience. The drugs available in Vietnam were accessible and cheap beyond anything available in the United States. Cannabis was ubiquitous. Opium could be obtained in the villages and markets through which American troops moved. And heroin, white heroin, pharmaceutical-grade purity, produced primarily in the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia, which encompassed the opium-growing highlands of Burma, Laos, and Thailand, was available in the vicinity of American bases in a concentrated and highly potent form. A cigarette soaked in liquid heroin, sold near base perimeters, provided a high of a quality and intensity that would have cost enormously more in any American city. The scale of heroin use among American military personnel became apparent to military authorities around 1970 and 1971. A survey commissioned by the Department of Defense in 1971 found that approximately 15% of enlisted personnel in Vietnam had used heroin during their service. Some estimates went higher. The figures were alarming enough that President Nixon, in a special message to Congress in June 1971, declared drug abuse America's public enemy number 1. This declaration marked the formal beginning of what would be called the War on Drugs, a framing that would shape American drug policy for the following half-century, with consequences that Nixon did not intend and would not have recognized. What happened to Vietnam veterans when they returned to the United States was, in one important respect, not what had been feared. The assumption, widely shared by politicians, military officials, and the public in 1971 and 1972, was that returning veterans who had developed heroin dependence in Vietnam would bring that dependence home and perpetuate it in American cities. This prospect generated significant federal anxiety. It drove a rapid expansion of treatment funding and helped create the federal treatment infrastructure that would persist in various forms for decades. The sociologist Lee Robbins of Washington University in St. Louis conducted the most rigorous study of what actually happened to veterans after their return. Her research, which followed a large cohort of Vietnam veterans through the years after their discharge, found that the large majority of those who had used heroin in Vietnam did not continue to use it after returning home. Of those who had been dependent on heroin in Vietnam, most had ceased use within a year of returning to the United States, and most had done so without formal treatment. The rates of continued dependence were substantially lower than anyone had predicted. Robin's findings, published in the mid-1970s, were genuinely surprising and generated considerable scientific and policy debate. They pointed toward the importance of context in shaping drug use, the observation that the same person in a radically different environment, with different social supports and different pressures and different reasons to use or not use a drug, might respond very differently to that drug than they had in the original context. The veterans who had used heroin in the particular circumstances of Vietnam, boredom, fear, availability, a culture of use among peers, often did not feel the same pull toward heroin when they returned to families, communities, and a context in which the drug was expensive, stigmatized, and practically inconvenient. This did not mean that no veterans returned with ongoing dependence. Many did, and the treatment system that had been expanded in anticipation of a large dependent veteran population served real people with real needs. But the scale was not what had been anticipated, and the explanation for why it was not what had been anticipated pointed toward dimensions of addiction that the dominant enforcement model had consistently underestimated. Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander had begun the work that would establish methadone maintenance treatment in New York in 1964. Dole was a metabolic disease specialist at Rockefeller University. Niswander was a psychiatrist who had spent years working with heroin-dependent patients in Harlem and had become deeply frustrated by the consistent failure of the available treatment approaches to produce lasting benefit for most of her patients. She had come to believe that the medical system's inability to offer these patients effective help was a failure of the medical system, not a failure of character on the part of the patients. Their collaboration proceeded from a hypothesis that heroin dependence involved a lasting metabolic change in the opioid system, an alteration in the brain's biochemical functioning that persisted after the drug was removed and that could not be corrected simply by stopping use. This was a medical hypothesis, framed in biological terms, and it had implications for treatment. If the problem was metabolic, then the response should be medical. Methadone, a synthetic opioid taken orally once daily, stabilized the opioid system without producing the sharp, euphoric rush of intravenous heroin, while also blocking the effect of additional heroin taken on top of it. This was, Dole and Niswander argued, a treatment for a metabolic condition, no different in principle from insulin for diabetes. Their clinical results, published in 1965 and 1966 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, were striking. Patients on methadone maintenance showed dramatic reductions in heroin use. They showed reductions in criminal activity. They were able to maintain employment, housing, family relationships. The drug was not a cure in the sense of restoring the pre-dependent state. Patients remained opioid dependent on methadone rather than heroin, and discontinuing methadone produced withdrawal. But for patients whose heroin dependence had disrupted every other aspect of their functioning, the stabilization that methadone offered was transformative in practical terms. The reception of methadone maintenance reflected the tensions in the broader field. Public health researchers focused on outcomes, employment, criminal justice involvement, health status, family stability were broadly supportive. Law enforcement officials and some politicians were uncomfortable with any treatment that involved prescribing an opioid to an opioid-dependent person, viewing it as trading one drug for another. Abstinence-based treatment advocates, whose philosophical commitments were grounded in the 12-step tradition, generally preferred complete abstinence as the only legitimate treatment goal and were skeptical of approaches that accepted continued opioid dependence as an acceptable outcome. Nixon's administration, despite the law and order rhetoric of the war on drugs, was actually pragmatic about methadone in the early 1970s. The prospect of tens of thousands of Vietnam veterans returning with heroin dependence created political pressure for effective treatment options, and methadone was the most clearly effective option available. Federal funding for methadone programs expanded significantly in 1971 and 1972. By 1973, approximately 80,000 patients were enrolled in methadone maintenance programs across the United States. The French Connection was disrupted in the early 1970s by a sustained enforcement effort that resulted in the prosecution of several major network participants. The Turkish government, responding to American diplomatic pressure, restricted opium poppy cultivation. For several years in the mid-1970s, heroin availability in American cities declined and use rates fell. The respite was temporary. New supply chains were already developing in Mexico, in Southeast Asia, and in the opium-producing regions of South Asia that would come to dominate the trade in the following decade. The market for heroin had been present since 1914. It would find new supply. The pattern that had been established in 1898 had not changed. New supply always found new routes to existing demand. The pharmacological reality of what diacetylmorphine did to the human brain had not changed since Felix Hoffmann wrote the synthesis in his notebook. What changed over and over were the routes and the prices and the politics and the faces of those most visibly affected. The need remained, as it had remained through every policy change and supply disruption and criminal prosecution and treatment innovation of the preceding 70 years. The failure of the Vietnam-era fear, the prediction of a massive wave of veteran heroin dependence that did not materialize at the predicted scale, had a second consequence beyond the scientific insight it generated. It contributed in some quarters to a kind of underestimation of heroin's risks in the civilian population. If large numbers of young men could use heroin in a war zone and then stop using it when they came home, the argument went, perhaps the dangers of heroin had been overstated. This argument missed the significance of Robin's finding. It was not that heroin was less addictive than believed, but that the conditions of use and the context in which a person used shaped the trajectory of that use in ways that purely pharmacological models had not captured. The clinical understanding of opioid dependence was advancing through the 1970s in ways that the policy environment of the era was not well positioned to translate into practice. Research on the neurobiology of addiction was producing increasingly detailed accounts of what happened to the brain under sustained opioid exposure. The concepts of receptor upregulation and downregulation, of the relationship between tolerance and withdrawal, of the neurological bases of craving, were being worked out in laboratories and described in papers that were read by specialists and rarely reached the general policy debate. The gap between the science and the policy was substantial and consequential. The expansion of methadone maintenance in the early 1970s was the most significant treatment development of the decade, but it carried with it a political vulnerability that would shape its subsequent history. Methadone was an opioid. Prescribing an opioid to an opioid-dependent person was, to critics, philosophically indistinguishable from providing heroin. The fact that methadone was oral rather than injected, that its pharmacological profile was different from heroin in ways that made it therapeutically useful while reducing its misuse potential, that the outcomes data consistently showed significant benefits for enrolled patients. These arguments were made repeatedly and documented thoroughly, and they were also consistently dismissed by critics for whom the category opioid carried moral rather than pharmacological weight. The population that most needed methadone maintenance and most benefited from it when they could access it was predominantly the same population that had been most severely affected by heroin since the 1940s. Black and Hispanic communities in major urban centres. The geography of access to methadone programs reflected and reinforced existing inequalities in access to healthcare. Programs were concentrated in urban centres with existing public health infrastructure. Rural areas, which would become substantially more affected by opioid dependence in later decades, had almost nothing. The mismatch between where the treatment was and where the people who needed it were living was a structural problem that no amount of clinical evidence for the treatment's effectiveness could resolve. The epidemic within the epidemic. By the early 1980s, heroin had been a fixture of American urban life for more than half a century. It was, in a sense, a known problem, present, documented, the subject of films and novels and federal task forces and decades of earnest and largely unsuccessful policy debate. And then something happened that made it significantly more lethal than it had been before, something that arrived through a different pathway and for years was not understood to be connected to heroin at all. The first cases of what would eventually be identified as AIDS appeared in the medical literature in 1981. The Centers for Disease Control published a report in June of that year describing an unusual cluster of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, a lung infection that was vanishingly rare in people with functioning immune systems, in 5 gay men in Los Angeles. Within weeks, reports of similar cases in New York and San Francisco reached the CDC. Within months, it was clear that the same syndrome was appearing in haemophiliacs who had received blood transfusions and in intravenous drug users, specifically in people who shared the needles and syringes used to inject heroin and other drugs. HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, is transmitted through blood and certain other bodily fluids. A hypodermic needle, used to inject heroin and then shared with another person before being sterilized, is among the most efficient transmission routes that the virus has access to in a population of people who are regularly engaged in the specific behavior that creates that route. The heroin-using population of American cities, already without adequate medical care, already living under the criminal justice pressures of the war on drugs, already economically marginalized in many cases, was exposed to HIV at rates that were catastrophic. In New York City, which had both the largest population of intravenous heroin users in the United States, and one of the earliest and most intense HIV epidemics, the intersection was devastating. HIV infection rates among intravenous drug users in New York were estimated at approximately 50% by the mid-1980s. In some social networks within this population, in some neighborhoods, the rates were higher. The virus moved through existing social infrastructure, through the networks of people who shared needles because needles were expensive and because possession of syringes without a prescription was illegal in New York State until 1992, creating a practical incentive to share. The public health response was complicated by the political environment. The Reagan administration's relationship with the AIDS epidemic in its early years was characterized broadly by silence. The epidemic was concentrated in populations, gay men, intravenous drug users, that did not command the immediate political sympathy of the administration or its constituency. Explicit federal public health messaging about AIDS was delayed. Federal funding for research and treatment was slower to materialize than the scale of the epidemic warranted. The Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, eventually produced a frank and scientifically serious report on AIDS in 1986, but by then 5 years of epidemic had already passed without that level of official communication. Needle exchange programs were the public health intervention most clearly demonstrated to reduce HIV transmission among intravenous drug users. The principle was simple: provide sterile needles to people who were going to inject regardless of whether they had sterile needles, removing the incentive to share used equipment and thereby interrupting one of HIV's primary transmission routes. Programs had been operating in the Netherlands since the early 1980s and producing measurable reductions in HIV transmission rates. The evidence was not ambiguous. Federal funding for needle exchange programs was prohibited by law in the United States, on the grounds that such programs might send the wrong message about drug use and potentially encourage it. Studies examining the effect of needle exchange on drug use rates consistently found no such increase. People who were already injecting heroin did not inject more heroin because clean needles were available. People who were not injecting heroin did not begin because clean needles were available. The programs reduced a specific, measurable harm without producing the feared increase in use. The evidence was presented to Congress on multiple occasions. The federal prohibition remained. Individual states and cities established programs with local or private funding, operating in the space between what the federal government prohibited and what local public health authorities understood to be necessary. New York City opened its first official needle exchange program in 1988. Following years of informal exchanges organized by AIDS activists and community organizations that had operated without official sanction, distributing needles from the trunks of cars and in community centers and on street corners, doing what the public health evidence said would help, because it was what the public health evidence said would help, in the communities most severely affected by the intersection of heroin dependence and HIV, the scale of loss in the 1980s was not experienced as a statistic. It was experienced as the ordinary fabric of life becoming thinner, people disappearing from it one at a time, funerals that accumulated into a different understanding of what was normal and what was survivable. The artists and musicians who documented this period, the painters, the writers, the photographers who worked in Harlem and in the East Village, and in communities across the country that were dealing with the same convergence, produced work that was, in some cases, remarkable, and that came out of circumstances that were not remarkable at all by the grim standard of what was happening. Crack cocaine arrived in the same communities in 1984 and 1985, with a speed that seemed, to those who were there to observe it, almost atmospheric. The drug, cocaine processed into a smokable form, sold in small quantities at low prices, reached populations that had not previously been part of the cocaine market, because powder cocaine had been expensive and crack was cheap. It produced an intense, brief euphoria, followed by a sharp and compulsive craving that drove rapid and repeated use. The public and political response to crack was enormous, fearful, and racially inflected in its imagery and its policy consequences. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine that would remain federal law for more than 2 decades. Possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. Possession of the same mandatory minimum sentence required 500 grams of powder cocaine. The pharmacological distinction between the 2 forms of cocaine was minimal. The demographic distinction between the typical crack user and the typical powder cocaine user was stark and was reflected in the sentencing data that accumulated over the following years. Heroin occupied a different position in the public imagination of the 1980s than crack. It was older news. It did not carry the same sense of novelty and escalating emergency that crack generated. The communities most severely affected by heroin, many of them the same communities most severely affected by crack, by HIV, by the deindustrialization that had eliminated the manufacturing jobs that had provided economic stability in the 1950s and 1960s, were not generating a great deal of sympathetic media coverage for their heroin problem specifically. The treatment system for heroin dependence in this period was fragmented, underfunded and organized around models that were not equally effective for all patients. Methadone maintenance existed and served real patients effectively, but the number of available treatment slots was consistently below the number of people seeking treatment. Waiting lists of weeks or months were common. Residential treatment programs, many operating on abstinence-based models, were available primarily to those who could afford private care or were fortunate enough to access the limited public funding. The combination of HIV infection and untreated heroin dependence in the same patient presented medical and social complexities that the system was not designed to address. By the end of the 1980s, the HIV epidemic had killed tens of thousands of intravenous drug users in the United States. It had also, in its terrible way, begun to shift some of the political and cultural conversation around harm reduction, the set of approaches that prioritized reducing the immediate harms associated with drug use over achieving abstinence as an endpoint. The argument for harm reduction had been made on public health grounds for years. The AIDS crisis made the cost of rejecting that argument visible in a way that was harder to ignore. The decade closed on a landscape in which heroin was more dangerous than it had been in any previous era. More dangerous not because the drug itself had changed, but because the epidemic within the epidemic had made the absence of sterile equipment and adequate medical care not merely an inconvenience but a death sentence. The crack epidemic and the heroin epidemic of the 1980s existed in the same community simultaneously, and their interaction was complex and not always clearly reported. Some people used both drugs in combination, heroin to ease the crash that followed crack's brief euphoria, crack to counteract the sedation of heroin. The medical and social consequences of polysubstance use were different from those of heroin use alone, and the treatment system, which had been developed primarily to address single substance dependence, was not well equipped to address the combination. Harm reduction as a formal philosophy and movement developed its most coherent articulation in this period, drawing on practices that had existed informally for years and giving them theoretical grounding and political organisation. The argument, stated simply, was that people who used drugs were going to continue to use drugs whether or not the state approved, and that the appropriate response to this fact was to reduce the harms associated with their use rather than to punish the use itself. This argument had antecedents in public health philosophy stretching back decades. But the AIDS crisis gave it an urgency and a specific testable claim that needle exchange reduces HIV transmission that could be evaluated empirically and defended in policy debates with data. The people who were doing this work in the 1980s, distributing needles from the trunks of cars, setting up makeshift exchanges in community centres, creating networks of volunteers who would bring naloxone to neighbourhoods where overdoses were common, were often people who were themselves affected by the epidemic. They were people who had lost partners and friends and family members. They were people who had been told by the political system that their communities were not worth the investment of a public health response. They did the work that the political system had decided it would not do, and they saved lives, and they were sometimes arrested for it. When the prescription ran out. The story of heroin in the 21st century cannot be understood without understanding the story of OxyContin, and the story of OxyContin cannot be understood without understanding what Purdue Pharma told the medical world in 1996, and how eagerly that story was received. Purdue Pharma was a privately held pharmaceutical company controlled by the Sackler family. In December 1995, the Food and Drug Administration approved OxyContin, a controlled-release formulation of oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid derived from thebaine, one of the alkaloids in the opium poppy. The controlled-release formulation was designed to provide 12 hours of pain relief from a single tablet by releasing the oxycodone gradually rather than all at once. This was a genuine pharmaceutical innovation in delivery mechanism. What was less genuine was the claim, central to Purdue's marketing strategy, that the controlled-release formulation significantly reduced OxyContin's potential for abuse. The claim rested on a pharmacological logic that was plausible in principle, but was not supported by the clinical evidence available at the time of the drug's approval. The argument was that a drug releasing opioids slowly over 12 hours would not produce the sharp concentration peak in the bloodstream that generated euphoria, and that without euphoria there would be limited potential for misuse. The argument had merit as a description of the drug's behaviour when taken as prescribed by a non-tolerant patient in an intact tablet. It did not describe what happened when a tablet was crushed and the extended release coating was defeated, an action that released the full oxycodone content immediately and produced a concentration spike substantially higher than any short-acting formulation would generate. Purdue's sales representatives visited physicians across the United States with a systematic and well-funded campaign. The company concentrated particular attention on primary care physicians in rural and suburban areas where pain was prevalent, where patients had limited access to specialist care, and where individual physicians made large volumes of prescribing decisions without the consultation and second opinion culture of major medical centres. The representatives carried medical literature, patient satisfaction questionnaires, promotional materials that framed OxyContin as a solution to the problem of undertreated pain. The undertreated pain narrative was not invented by Purdue. A genuine and legitimate movement within pain medicine had been arguing since the 1980s that American physicians were too conservative in their prescribing of opioids for chronic pain, that patients were suffering unnecessarily because of excessive caution, rooted in exaggerated fears of addiction. The argument had scientific support for certain patient populations, patients with cancer-related pain, patients with severe end-of-life pain conditions. Purdue's marketing took this legitimate argument and extended it dramatically beyond the patient populations for which the evidence existed, to encompass the full range of chronic pain conditions that primary care physicians encountered daily. Prescriptions increased rapidly. By the early 2000s, OxyContin was being prescribed at levels that bore no rational relationship to the incidence of the severe pain conditions it had originally been approved to treat. It was being prescribed for back pain, for dental pain, for post-surgical pain, for the ordinary painful conditions of ordinary life. People who took it as prescribed for extended periods developed physical dependence on oxycodone, the same physiological process that had developed in patients taking Bayer's heroin in 1899, the same process that had created the morphine dependence problem that the Harrison Act had been designed to address. The history that should have informed the response to OxyContin had been documented for a century. It was not absent from the medical literature, it was simply not consulted. When prescriptions ended, or when patients found they needed more than their prescription provided, they faced the situation that opioid-dependent people had faced since 1914: how to obtain the drug they needed in a market that did not legally supply it. Some patients sought additional prescriptions from multiple physicians. Some obtained OxyContin through other informal channels. A significant number discovered that heroin was cheaper, more accessible, and pharmacologically interchangeable with the opioid they had been prescribed. The body on opioids does not distinguish sharply between different opioid molecules. It responds to opioid receptor stimulation. The person who had been prescribed OxyContin for 18 months and was now dependent on oxycodone found that heroin provided the same relief for a fraction of the price. The demographics of heroin use shifted visibly in the first decade of the 21st century. The population of heroin users in American cities had been predominantly black and Hispanic for several decades, a consequence of the history described in previous chapters of the way heroin had moved into economically marginalized communities in the 1940s and 1950s, and of the criminal justice responses that had reinforced rather than reduced the concentration of use in those communities. The population entering heroin use through the prescription opioid pathway was substantially different. Disproportionately white, disproportionately suburban and rural, disproportionately young people from communities that had not previously had significant heroin problems. The public and political response to this demographic shift was more sympathetic than the responses to earlier heroin epidemics had been. Congressional testimony began to describe heroin dependence as disease requiring medical treatment, rather than a moral failing requiring punishment. Newspaper coverage carried portraits of families in the affected communities, portraits that were empathetic and humanizing in ways that coverage of the heroin epidemic in Harlem in the 1950s or in urban black communities in the 1980s had not consistently been. The framing shift was real and produced some genuinely beneficial policy changes. It was also to public health workers and community advocates who had been working in urban communities dealing with heroin dependence for decades, a documentation of how differently the same crisis was received depending on whose communities it was happening to. And then fentanyl entered the supply chain and everything became more dangerous. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid developed by the Belgian pharmacologist Paul Janssen in 1960, initially for use in anesthesia. It is approximately 100 times more potent than morphine by weight, a property that made it useful in surgical settings, where small, precisely measured doses could be administered under controlled conditions to patients whose breathing and vital signs were being continuously monitored. In those settings, fentanyl's extreme potency was manageable, and its pharmacological properties were genuinely valuable. In the illicit drug supply, the same properties made it extraordinarily dangerous. Illicit fentanyl began appearing in the North American drug supply around 2013 and 2014. The initial source was primarily China, where chemical manufacturers were producing fentanyl and fentanyl analogues from precursor chemicals and shipping them directly or through intermediary countries to the North American market. By the mid-2010s, Mexican drug trafficking organizations had begun manufacturing fentanyl as well, using precursors obtained primarily from China, and distributing it through the same channels they used for heroin and other drugs. Suppliers discovered that fentanyl could be mixed with heroin to increase its potency at lower cost per dose, or used as a direct heroin substitute. A kilogram of pharmaceutical quality heroin and a kilogram of fentanyl produced very different numbers of doses and very different profits. Fentanyl was substantially more profitable. The problem was that the quantity of fentanyl required to produce the same effect as a standard dose of heroin was so small, measured in micrograms rather than milligrams, that even distribution through a larger batch required equipment and technique that clandestine manufacturers rarely possessed. A batch of drug sold as heroin might have fentanyl concentrated into certain portions and absent from others, with no indication to the user which they had obtained. The naloxone distribution efforts that had expanded through the 2010s. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist that rapidly reverses overdose by displacing opioids from the brain's receptors, were saving lives across the country. Emergency medical responders carried it. Community organizations distributed it. Family members of people with opioid dependence were trained in its administration. The drug was effective, and the training was not difficult. Lives were saved. But overdose death rates continued to rise. The period from 2016 onward saw annual overdose death tolls in the United States that exceeded the total American combat deaths in Vietnam several times over. In 2021, more than 100,000 Americans died of drug overdoses, the highest figure ever recorded and substantially above the totals from any previous year. The great majority of these deaths involved opioids, and the great majority of those involved synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl. The drug that Felix Hoffmann had synthesized in Elberfeld in 1897 was no longer the primary opioid killing people, but it had opened, and kept open, the pathway through which something far more dangerous eventually arrived. The pharmacological family was the same. The human opioid system that heroin had exploited in 1898 was the same system that fentanyl was exploiting in 2020. What had changed was the potency, the accessibility, the extent of the supply chain, the number of people in its path, and the century of accumulated understanding of what was happening and why. The understanding had grown enormously. The gap between what was understood and what was being done about it had not proportionally closed. The Sackler family, which controlled Purdue Pharma, became the subject of extensive litigation and investigation in the years following the public identification of OxyContin as a significant driver of the opioid crisis. Multiple state attorneys general filed suit. The federal government negotiated settlements. A series of journalistic investigations documented in detail what Purdue's internal communications revealed about what the company had known and when it had known it. The picture that emerged was of a company that had had access to data indicating that its product was being misused at significant scale and that had continued its marketing practices in the face of that data. The history of the opioid crisis as it unfolded in the first 2 decades of the 21st century is, in many respects, a history of institutions. pharmaceutical companies, regulatory agencies, medical professional organizations, prescription monitoring programs, responding to a crisis that had been building for years, more slowly than the crisis built. Each institution had reasons, some of them bureaucratic and some of them financial, and some of them genuinely related to the complexity of the medical and social situation, for responding less quickly and less comprehensively than the situation required. The gap between the rate of institutional response and the rate of harm was where most of the deaths occurred. The communities that bore the heaviest burden of the fentanyl epidemic in its most acute phase were, in a pattern that was by now familiar, those with the least access to treatment and the least political power to demand it. Rural communities in Appalachia, the rural Midwest, and the rural South had been among the earliest and most severely affected by the prescription opioid crisis, and were among the most severely affected by the fentanyl crisis that followed. These communities had limited access to the treatment modalities that were most effective, buprenorphine, methadone, partly because of geography, partly because of the regulatory constraints that had historically limited their availability, and partly because the stigma around medication-assisted treatment remained a barrier in communities where abstinence-based models had been more culturally dominant. The science that came too late and just in time. The opioid receptor was formally described in 1973. 3 research teams, led by Candice Pert and Solomon Snyder at Johns Hopkins, by Lars Torenius in Uppsala, and by Eric Simon at New York University, identified, nearly simultaneously, the molecular structures in the brain and nervous system through which opioids produced their effects. The discovery explained, for the first time in precise biological terms, why opioids worked the way they did, why tolerance developed, and what the physiological mechanism of dependence actually was. It also explained something that had puzzled pharmacologists: why the human brain had receptors specifically shaped for compounds derived from the opium poppy. The evolutionary logic of having receptors exquisitely tailored to a plant chemical would make no sense unless the body produced its own versions of those chemicals. The endorphins, endogenous morphine, from the Greek word for within, were identified in 1975 by John Hughes and Hans Kosterlitz in Aberdeen. The human body produced opioid compounds naturally, for the management of pain, for the regulation of reward and pleasure, for basic functions of nervous system maintenance. The opium poppy had been exploiting the same receptor system for millennia. What had changed was that chemistry had learned to do it too, and at a scale the poppy could not approach. This understanding transformed the scientific framing of opioid dependence. If the opioid receptors were sites of normal physiological function, and if repeated exposure to external opioids caused the receptors to adjust their baseline sensitivity in ways that required the continued presence of the drug to maintain normal function, then what was called addiction was not primarily a moral condition or a character failure. It was a neurological adaptation, a change in how the brain worked, produced by the sustained presence of a compound that bound to the brain's own regulatory systems. The clinical implications were significant. A condition with a biological basis required biological treatment. The observation that people could simply choose to stop using opioids if they were sufficiently motivated was not wrong as a statement of possibility. Some people did stop, without treatment, through an act of will sustained over the weeks of severe physical withdrawal and the longer period of neurological readjustment that followed. But the observation missed the scale of what was being asked. The opioid-dependent brain had reorganized itself around the presence of the drug. The process of reorganizing back was not a matter of willpower applied to a craving. It was a matter of a disrupted nervous system re-establishing its equilibrium over weeks or months, while the person experiencing this process also had to navigate the rest of their life. Buprenorphine, a partial opioid agonist, was developed in the 1970s and approved in various countries for pain management and opioid dependence treatment over the following decades. In the United States, the Drug Addiction Treatment Act of 2000 allowed qualified physicians to prescribe buprenorphine for opioid dependence treatment in office-based settings, an important departure from the restrictions on opioid prescribing that had been in place since the Harrison Act era. A physician who had previously been prohibited from prescribing maintenance opioid treatment could now, with appropriate training and licensure, prescribe buprenorphine to patients in their regular practice. This was a significant policy shift, though its implementation was constrained by a number of practical and bureaucratic limitations that slowed the expansion of access for years. The regulatory structure that governed buprenorphine prescribing was more cumbersome than the structure for most other medications. Stigma within the medical profession itself, the residual influence of the view that prescribing opioids to opioid-dependent patients was enabling rather than treating, meant that many physicians with the qualification to prescribe buprenorphine chose not to. The combination of these factors meant that the treatment remained substantially less accessible than the population that needed it required. The harm reduction movement, which had developed through the 1980s and 1990s in response to the AIDS epidemic, and the human costs of purely abstinence-focused and enforcement-focused approaches, had become by the 2000s a substantial and internationally recognized component of drug policy in many countries. The practical elements of harm reduction, needle exchanges, naloxone distribution, supervised consumption sites, drug testing services, were supported by a growing body of evidence demonstrating their effectiveness at reducing death, disease, and other measurable harms without producing the increases in drug use that their critics had predicted. In Switzerland, a program of heroin-assisted treatment had been operating since 1994, providing pharmaceutical-grade heroin to a carefully selected population of long-term dependent users who had not responded to other treatments. The program was evaluated rigorously. The results showed reductions in illicit drug use, improvements in health, reductions in criminal activity, and improvements in social functioning and housing stability. The Swiss voters approved continuation of the program in a national referendum in 2008 with a substantial majority. The program continued to operate. The Dutch followed with a similar program. Canada would eventually permit limited heroin-assisted treatment in certain clinical settings. Heroin-assisted treatment, providing pharmaceutical heroin in clinical settings under medical supervision to patients with long-term dependence who had not benefited from other treatments, represented a return, in some respects, to the medical model that the Harrison Act's enforcement regime had foreclosed in the 1920s. The difference was that the 21st century version was conducted with a century of additional understanding of what opioid dependence was, what treatment could achieve, and what the cost of leaving it untreated was. The Swiss and Dutch programs were not open pharmacies. They were clinical programs with careful selection criteria, structured support, and active management of the patients enrolled. The result, in the patient populations that participated, was measurably positive. The United States did not adopt heroin-assisted treatment. The political and cultural environment that had shaped American drug policy since the Harrison Act, the framing of drug use as a moral and criminal problem, the resistance to any approach that could be characterized as enabling or providing drugs, remained influential enough to make the approach impractical politically, even when it was supported by the international evidence. American harm reduction advocates pointed to the Swiss and Dutch results consistently. American drug policy continued to be shaped by a different set of considerations. By the early 2020s, the landscape of opioid treatment in the United States had changed significantly from what it had been even 20 years earlier. The COVID-19 pandemic, which created practical barriers to in-person clinic visits, drove a rapid relaxation of some of the regulatory requirements around telemedicine prescription of buprenorphine. Treatment reached patients who had previously been unable to access it because of geography, transportation, or the administrative burden of regular clinic visits. The emergency change demonstrated what harm reduction advocates and treatment researchers had been arguing for decades: that reducing barriers to treatment access produced more people in treatment. The fentanyl epidemic that had killed more than 100,000 Americans in a single year was not going to be resolved quickly or by any single intervention. The supply chain for illicit fentanyl was different in kind from the supply chain for heroin, which had always depended on cultivated opium poppies and the geographical constraints they imposed. Fentanyl could be synthesized from industrial precursor chemicals in facilities that did not require agricultural land or climate-specific growing conditions. The economics of fentanyl production and distribution were different from heroin's economics in ways that made traditional supply-side enforcement even less effective than it had previously been. Naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, had by 2023 been approved for over-the-counter sale in the United States, making it accessible without a prescription for the first time. The drug had existed since the 1960s and had been available in emergency medical settings for decades. The decision to make it available without a prescription was viewed as a matter of simple public health logic, obviously sensible. It had been delayed for years by the same complex of factors that had delayed other harm reduction measures. The political concern that making the reversal of overdose more accessible might reduce the deterrent effect of overdose as a consequence of drug use, as if deterrence rather than treatment was the appropriate frame for understanding what overdose was and what it meant. The arc from 1898 to the present is long, and it is not straight. It passes through laboratories and pharmacies and congressional hearings, and prison cells and emergency rooms and the living rooms of ordinary people trying to manage their own or their family's pain. It passes through the offices of physicians who prescribed in good faith, and the offices of executives who understood more than they disclosed. It passes through the wars and the migrations and the economic convulsions that created the conditions in which drugs moved and took hold and refused to let go. What the arc traces is not primarily a story about chemistry, though chemistry is part of it. It is a story about the relationship between what we know and what we do with what we know, about the gaps between understanding and action, between evidence and policy, between the needs of the people most affected and the priorities of the systems designed to address those needs. The gap has narrowed since 1898. It has not closed. It remains still, the place where most of the suffering happens. The Portuguese model of drug decriminalization, implemented in 2001, was another data point that entered the international policy debate in this period and challenged assumptions that had been treated as settled for decades. Portugal had decriminalized the personal possession of all drugs, not just cannabis, but heroin, cocaine, and other controlled substances, and redirected the resources previously spent on prosecution and incarceration toward treatment and social support. Critics predicted that use rates would rise dramatically. They did not. The use rates in Portugal remained broadly comparable to European averages, while treatment uptake increased significantly, and HIV infection rates among intravenous drug users fell substantially. The Portuguese experiment did not demonstrate that decriminalization was a universal solution, but it demonstrated that the predicted catastrophic consequences of removing criminal penalties from personal possession did not materialize. The opioid receptor antagonist naltrexone, which had been available since the 1980s, received renewed attention in the 2010s as an extended-release injectable formulation that could be administered monthly, removing the compliance challenges associated with daily oral medication. Research demonstrated its effectiveness for both alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorder, and the monthly injection model addressed one of the practical barriers to consistent medication adherence. The existence of multiple effective pharmacological tools for opioid use disorder, methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, each with somewhat different pharmacological profiles and somewhat different clinical applications, represented a genuine advance over the situation of even 30 years earlier, when methadone was the only approved option in most of the world. What the arc of the science reveals, looked at from a sufficient distance, is a pattern of understanding arriving faster than the systems designed to apply it can adapt. The neuroscience of opioid dependence advanced rapidly from the 1970s onward. The clinical evidence for effective treatments accumulated across the 1980s and 1990s. The policy frameworks that governed access to those treatments changed far more slowly, constrained by legal structures that were built on assumptions that the science had superseded, by political considerations that were not primarily about public health, and by the residual moral framework that had shaped drug policy since the Harrison Act. The scientific understanding of what opioid dependence was had largely caught up to the reality by the turn of the millennium. The policy and cultural responses to that understanding still had a great deal of catching up to do. What the records remember. The bottle that Bayer placed in pharmacies in 1898 was small. The story it opened was not. More than a century of documents now traces the arc of diacetylmorphine through human history, through patent records and medical journals and congressional testimonies and court filings and police blotters, and the private letters of ordinary people who were trying to explain, to someone they trusted, what was happening to them. The records do not tell a simple story. They tell a story about the difficulty of seeing clearly when the thing you're looking at is both genuinely useful and genuinely dangerous at the same time, and when the people who might see it most clearly are also the people with the most to gain from not seeing. Heroin was, for certain people with certain conditions, a genuinely effective medicine. It suppressed coughs in a way that few other compounds of the era could approach. It relieved pain that was otherwise unmanageable. In the tuberculosis sanatoriums of 1899 and 1900, it gave people who were dying difficult deaths a measure of rest and ease that nothing else then available could reliably provide. This is part of the record, and it should remain part of the record because the history of heroin that erases its genuine utility in its rush to condemn it is not a more accurate history. It is a simpler one. The pharmacological reality underneath the medicine was not visible to the physicians who first used it. The opioid receptor would not be clearly described until 1973. The endorphins would not be identified until 1975. The mechanisms of tolerance and physical dependence at the molecular level were not understood until later still. What Druggist and Hoffmann and the physicians who prescribed heroin in 1899 did not know was not, in most cases, information that was simply being ignored. It was information that did not yet exist. This contextualizes what happened without excusing all of it. The physicians and companies who continued to market heroin and describe it as non-addictive after the case reports began to accumulate in 1901 and 1902 were operating with a different epistemic situation than the original proponents of 1898. By 1903, the evidence that heroin produced dependence in patients who used it at ordinary medical doses over ordinary time periods was no longer absent from the literature. It was present and being discussed. The decision to continue the original marketing claims in the face of that accumulating evidence is a different kind of decision from the original honest error. The people who took heroin in 1899 and became dependent on it suffered consequences that were just as real as those suffered by people who became dependent in 1960 or 2010. The suffering did not differ in quality because it occurred in a period when less was understood. It differed in the resources available to address it, and in the social and medical frameworks available to make sense of it, and in the degree to which the people experiencing it were understood as patients rather than criminals or moral failures. Those differences were large and consequential. Bayer was certain in 1898 that it had tested heroin sufficiently to know what it was. The tests were, by contemporary standards, reasonably thorough. The tests were also too short, too small, and conducted under conditions that could not reveal the compound's true character over the timescale of ordinary medical use. The certainty was not feigned. It was genuine, and it was wrong. And the gap between the genuine certainty and the actual truth was wide enough to accommodate, across the following century, an enormous volume of human suffering. The pattern repeated in 1996 with a different drug and a different company, and a much more advanced scientific understanding of what opioids were and what they did. The scientific literature on opioid tolerance and dependence was extensive and well established by 1996. The claim that a controlled release formulation would significantly reduce addiction risk was a claim that flew in the face of a century of accumulated pharmacological knowledge. It was made anyway, with confidence, marketed aggressively, and accepted widely. The consequences were measured in hundreds of thousands of deaths across 2 decades. What connects 1898 and 1996 is not primarily the chemistry, though the chemistry connects them. What connects them is the structure of incentive and belief that can produce a confident claim about the safety of a substance, sustain that claim in the face of contrary evidence, and find in the commercial and professional environment of the day enough people willing to accept it to generate an epidemic that takes decades to name and longer to address. The regulatory frameworks that exist now are incomparably more rigorous than anything available when heroin was brought to market. The scientific understanding of opioid pharmacology is immeasurably deeper. The treatment options are effective in ways that nothing available in 1900 could approach. What has not changed is the pharmacological reality of what opioids are and what they do to the human brain. An opioid taken in sufficient quantity over sufficient time will produce physical dependence in any human body, not a moral failing, not a consequence of weakness, a consequence of chemistry, working on the same receptors in every human brain, without exception. Understanding this, consistently and fully, and allowing that understanding to shape both treatment and policy, remains work in progress. The work is genuine. The progress is real. It is not as fast as the need. The bottle with the buyer label is in archives now. The archives are quiet places. The label has faded over the decades and the confident red and black printing gone pale with time, the typeface still legible but no longer commanding. The product name is still there. Heroin. The company name is still there. Bayer. Everything that was printed on the label in 1898 is still printed on the label now, and everything it meant in 1898 is different from everything it means today, and the distance between those two meanings is the history. The night has settled now. Somewhere in a city that still carries all of this history in its streets, and its hospitals, and its courtrooms, and its emergency rooms, and its quiet rooms, where people are trying to sleep, the lights are low. The sounds are the sounds of a city at rest, a distant car, a settling building, the particular quality of urban air in the small hours when the day's business is done, and what remains is the city itself, breathing. The brown glass bottle is in an archive. The Elberfeld laboratory where Felix Hoffmann worked was demolished long ago. The building that replaced it has itself been replaced. The physicians who first wrote enthusiastically about heroin in 1899 have been dead for a century. The patients they treated, the tubercular patients who rested more easily for a time, the morphine-dependent veterans who were told this would be better, the women who asked no questions because the doctor had recommended it, and the doctor was a person of authority and good intentions. They too are gone. What remains is the record, the careful, voluminous, sometimes harrowing record of what happened when human curiosity and commercial ambition and genuine medical need and incomplete knowledge were placed in proximity with a compound that the human body receives as deeply and as irrevocably as this one. You've been listening for a long time. The story has been long. It has crossed oceans and decades and the borders of a dozen countries. It has passed through laboratories and pharmacies and shipping crates and hospital wards and courtrooms, and the living rooms of ordinary people who are simply trying to manage their pain, or their grief, or the particular combination of circumstances that led them to this particular compound in this particular moment. It has taken more than a century to get from the brown bottle on the pharmacy shelf to where we are now, and where we are now is not the end of the story. The story continues in every clinic that offers treatment, and every one that cannot offer enough of it. It continues in every community that has learned to carry naloxone and everyone that does not yet have enough. It continues in the research laboratories, where the neuroscience of opioid dependence is still being worked out, and in the policy offices where decisions about treatment and enforcement are still being made, with varying degrees of fidelity to what the science has shown. But for tonight, the story is quiet. The archive is dark. The old bottle sits on its shelf. The label has faded over the decades. The confident red and black printing gone pale with time. The typeface still legible, but no longer commanding the certainty it once commanded. The company name is still there. The product name is still there. Everything that was printed on the label in 1898 is still printed on the label now, and the distance between what those words meant then and what they mean today is the distance that all of this history has travelled. Let your breath slow. Let the details of the century go soft at the edges, the way old photographs go soft. Still there, still real, but no longer demanding your full attention. The shapes of things remain. The year 1898 is still there, and the brown glass, and the pharmacist's smile, and the cough down the hall. All of it still there, just held more gently now, at the distance that sleep makes possible. Your breath is slow and even. The story rests. You rest. If you enjoyed this story, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if there's a substance or a chapter of history you'd like me to cover next, leave it in the comments below. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well.